Draw Me Close to You is a great song, and I think it's a great prayer. That should be a prayer that we as believers pray. You're all I want. You're all I've ever needed. I love that part of the song. And what we're going to see tonight in the book of Numbers in chapter 20 and 21, if you'd like to turn there, please. What we're going to see tonight is for the Israelites, they had a choice to make. And if God was going to be their all in all, if he was going to be all sufficient for them, or if they were going to need something else or want something else or chase after something else. And we probably all in our lives go through a time like that where we have to decide, is Jesus really all we want? Is he really all that we need? Or do we maybe pay lip service to Jesus, but then still look for fulfillment, or look for healing, look for help or answers in other places? In Numbers chapter 20 tonight, in a message I've titled Snakes on a Plane, it's a story that may be familiar to some of you. It's one of these, because to be honest, most of us don't spend much time in the book of Numbers during our quiet time. We don't preach a whole lot out of the book of Numbers, but there's a couple of events from this book that are popular, and one of them is what we're going to see here tonight. Now, but before we get to the part of the story that may be a little bit more familiar as far as the snakes go, we're going to look at Moses, who's been the faithful leader of Israel for a long time. Moses, and that's what the series has been, one of the great heroes of the faith. Hasn't been a verse by verse, walking through Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers, but looking at some of the major points in the life of Moses, as we did with David and Joseph and Esther and others, Daniel. But what we see tonight with Moses is he was a man who did so well for so long, and we're going to see one little mistake is going to cost Moses so much. And so tonight, if you take notes, I only have 2 points, but if you want to jot them down, the first one is we're going to see that Moses messed up. Moses reminds us that he's human. From all the times that Moses stood in the gap when Israel was whining and complaining, all the times that God said, Moses, I'm going to wipe them all out, and I'm going to start over with you, and I'm going to make you the leader of a new nation. Moses said, no, God, don't do that. You promised Abraham. All the time that Moses defended his sister who was murmuring behind his back, and God gave her leprosy, and then here comes Moses, God, please heal my sister. All the times that everybody else was messing up, and Moses was the intercessor. Moses was the one that went between the sinning people and the holy God. For all the times we see that, we're going to see tonight that Moses shows us that he's human. Moses made a mistake. And it might not seem like a big mistake, but it certainly cost him. So we're going to see that Moses messed up. If you're in chapter 20, we're going to read beginning in the 2nd verse, and we're going to go down to verse 11. Here's what it says, or verse 12, I guess. But verse 2, it says, Now there was no water for the congregation. And so they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. And the people quarreled with Moses and said, we wish that we would have perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness, that we should die here, both we and our cattle? And why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It is no place for grain, or figs, or vines, or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink. Then Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting, the tabernacle. And they fell on their faces. And the glory of Yahweh appeared to them. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. So you shall bring water out of the rock for them, and give drink to the congregation and to their cattle. And Moses, he obeys. Moses took the staff from before as the Lord commanded him. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand, and he struck the rock with his staff twice. And water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their livestock. Verse 12, though, it says, And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, Because you did not believe in me, to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. I get goosebumps when I read it. I feel so bad for Moses. I mean, what a great guy. Moses is one of the heroes of the faith. Moses is somebody that we hold in high esteem. And so many times we point to Moses and say, be like Moses. Look what Moses did here. This is our model. He's our example. Be like Moses. And all the times he put up with their complaining. And 37 years prior to this passage, 37 years ago, At Kadesh Barnea, we saw this the other week. The people complained, and God finally had enough. Remember, they complained about meat. Oh, all this bread, we want meat. In Egypt, we had all kinds of fish to eat. And all the complaining. They complained because there was no water. They complained because they were tired. They complained about so many things. And then finally, when they sent the spies, and remember the 12 spies go in, 10 come back. Oh yeah, we know this is the promised land, but those giants are going to kill us. And only 2 brought back a good report. That's when God said, enough. And so God said, this older generation, you're not going to go into the promised land. But Moses, who was of the older generation, he was still going to get to go in the promised land because he was good and faithful. He wasn't one of the complainers. So here we are, 37 years later. The Bible kind of skips a big chunk. And 37 years later, that's a long time. For 37 years, they've been walking in circles in the wilderness. In fact, it tells us in verse 13, it says these are the waters of Meribah. This is the exact same place where 37 years ago, God told Moses, you take your staff and you go hit that rock, and it's going to give water to everybody. So 1.5 million people, or 2 million people, and all of their cattle get all this water from a rock. Why are they in the same place 37 years later? Because they're literally walking in circles. Some of y'all wives would have told your husbands to pull over and ask for directions already. We're driving in circles out here. We've passed this rock before. I remember it. 37 years they're walking in circles because God is just waiting for them to die. That's not a fun way to go, is it? I mean, my thing would have been, God, kill me now. Don't make me walk for 40 years. But this was their punishment. And when that older generation had all died off, and the reason they did it, they could have all just dropped dead, but there was all these kids. And so during that 40 years, the kids were growing up, and they were going to be the ones to go in and possess the promised land. And so this was really an investment for their future. But Moses was going to get to go in there with them because Moses was good, and he was not a complainer. And here we are 37 years later. How much complaining did Moses hear in 37 years? It's not recorded for us. The Bible skips 37 years. But how much complaining did Moses hear all that time? I mean, we see it. We turn the page, we pick up, and they're right where they left off. I mean, look at all that they're whining about here. Look at all that they're crying about in chapter 20. They're quarreling with Moses. I mean, they're not just griping to themselves, but it's Moses' fault. I mean, they're going to Moses. They're angry about it. We wish that we would have died when our brothers died. We see the older generation, they're starting to die off. We wish we would have died too. This is brutal. Why have you brought us into the wilderness so that we're going to die? And we even see their concern for their livestock. Us and our cattle, we're going to die out here. And to Moses, you have made us come out of Egypt to this evil place. Now it's Moses' fault. Now they're missing slavery in Egypt again. Moses, we had it all fine. Life was good, Moses. When the taskmasters were whipping us and making us build the pyramids and they were killing our baby boys, Moses, you took us away from that. We liked it back there, Moses, and you made us leave Egypt where we had pomegranates and we had figs and we had grain and we had vines, Moses, and we had water. And you took us out of Egypt and you brought us to this evil place. What's this evil place? The promised land? The land flowing with milk and honey? The land where if they would have just believed God and gone in and conquered the giants, they would have been living in it for the last 37 years. But instead they say, Moses, you took us out of Egypt. You brought us to this evil place. I believe Moses heard that for 37 years. He had been just so fed up with it, but yet he falls on his face before God and he intercedes once again for the people. God, you've got to come through again. God, you've got to provide for these people again. And God does just that once again. We see the patience, the long suffering of God. And so God says, just go and speak to the rock, Moses. Just go tell the rock to give you water, and it will. And so Moses obeys. He gets up, he grabs the staff, and he goes to it. And we can't blame Moses for being a little snippy with the people. You rebels, you want me to just get you water from this rock? Well, watch this. Why does he do it? Why does he grab his staff and hit the rock? God just told him to speak to it. And I don't know what the answer to that is. I have no idea why Moses didn't just speak to the rock. Why he hit it. And it says he hit it twice. I don't believe that's a wasted word. I believe there's something in there for why Moses hit the rock twice. Maybe because he had hit it once 37 years ago, the exact same rock. Maybe he thought this time I'll hit it twice. You know, maybe a couple years down the road we got to do it, I'll hit it 3 times. We don't know what Moses was thinking. But we know what God says to him. In verse 12, he says, because you did not believe me. It's hard to imagine that Moses didn't believe in God, right? I mean, Moses has witnessed it all firsthand. To me, it's like the disciples in the Gospels not believing in Jesus when they witnessed all the miracles. It's mind-boggling to me, but Moses has been through all this, and God says, Moses, you didn't believe me. What, that God didn't have the ability to make water come out of a rock if he spoke to it? This is kind of foolish, isn't it? Like Moses thought, okay, God, that's a little too much. That's a little far-fetched. I'm going to hit the rock to help you out. Like hitting a rock makes water come out of it, right? But Moses, who has seen the Red Seas parted, doesn't believe that God can make water come out of a rock if he speaks to it. So he's got to help God out and give that rock a couple of taps with a staff. I don't know. It's hard for me to accept that Moses did not believe God can do it. And if it weren't for the plain language of the text, I'd say that's wrong. But God says, Moses, you didn't believe me, so I'm inclined to believe God in this one. But it's just really hard for me to wrap my mind around Moses not believing in God. But you know what this shows me? It's like I said at the beginning, Moses is human. This is one of the rare glimpses we have into the humanity of Moses, because he seems superhuman before this. He almost seems divine before this. Moses is as close to perfect as anybody we see in Scripture. We have years and years of Moses' life, and we see very few mistakes. And you contrast that with so many other people. Peter always putting his foot in his mouth. You know, David committing adultery and killing somebody and not being where he's supposed to be. We see so many mistakes from so many people. And Moses, what's Moses' big offense? He hits a rock instead of speaking to it? It just shows us that Moses is human. And every one of us, we're human too. And so we make mistakes, and sometimes they're not even big mistakes by our logic, by our understanding. But this shows us that a very holy God who tells us a certain way to do something, he expects it to be done the way he says to do it. And if God says speak to a rock, we don't need to go hit it with a stick. If God says speak to a rock, let us speak to a rock. And that was for Moses. But God tells us to do things too, and we better obey God the way he says to do it. We say, oh, what's the big deal? It's a big deal to Moses. Moses already survived the first punishment from God. When God said, all right, if you're 40 and up, you don't get to go to the promised land. Moses survived that. But this time God says, Moses and Aaron, y'all were going to take them into the promised land, but now you're not. The book of Joshua would probably be called the book of Moses if Moses had not done this. But instead, Moses is now going to have to leave the scene and pass the mantle on to his successor. And Joshua is going to be the one to do what Moses had been preparing to do for all these years. So it shows us that God is a specific God. He expects it to be done the way he says to do it. And it's not up to us to try to put our spin on how we think it should be. If God says speak to a rock, we would say, well, God, let me think about this. God, we understand scientifically speaking to a rock is never going to give water. So God, I'm smart enough to know that I really need to just hit the rock to help you out. No, it's not up to us to put our own human understanding into it. It's up to us to simply do what that old hymn says and trust and obey. If this is what God says to do, then we are to obey him. And Moses pays dearly for it, and I dare say that there are times in our lives where we have paid dearly for the times that we chose not to obey God. Things that we might not think are important. And yeah, I know we have some of our students in here tonight. And are you allowed to chew gum in school? You're homeschooled. Are you allowed to chew gum? Probably at Lockhart there's no rules. I don't know. We'll see in the high school next year. But chewing gum. When I was a kid, we couldn't chew gum in school, right? And I know for y'all too, because kids would stick it under the desk, right? I don't know what that's about. But we couldn't chew gum in school, and I remember people that would, hide a little piece of gum back there. They'd have a piece of gum and they'd kind of slowly chew on it throughout the day. What's the big deal about chewing gum at school? Is that a felony? If you get caught with gum, it's not a big deal. But you know why it is a big deal? Because if the rule says no chewing gum and you break it, it's not about how much harm we think we did. It's about whether or not we chose to obey, whether or not we choose to respect authority. We say, I just chewed a little gum here. I'm just driving 15 over the speed limit here. What's the big deal? The things that we might try to justify, but if that's the rule, it's the rule. And if God gives us a rule, even if we think, well, it's just hitting a rock, if God gives us a rule and says, do it this way, we'd better do it this way. And so Moses messed up. And this cost not only Moses his life, and we're not going to get to that yet, but it does cost Aaron his. And so if you look ahead just to the end of the chapter here in verse 28, It says Moses stripped Aaron of his garments, that's his high priestly robe, and he put them on Eleazar his son. And Aaron died there at the top of the mountain, and Moses and Eleazar came down from the mountain. When Moses dies and when Aaron dies, we don't get any other details except they died in the mountain. So these are not two guys that are on life support. They're not in hospice care, wasting away. Aaron walks up into a mountain with his son and just never comes back down. And Moses will do the same thing. Moses will give a farewell speech, and we'll see that, maybe in a week or so. Moses will give a farewell speech, which is what the whole book of Deuteronomy is. And then that's it. And then he's just gone. He's in heaven. And one way or the other, God just snuffed out his life. God just said, all right, that's it. Your time down here is done. And we don't know how it happened. We don't know where the body ended up or anything like that. But that just shows that these were guys that were not on their deathbed, but this was the price they paid for their sin. God said, it's time. You're not going to the promised land. And so Moses goes up in the mountain, and that's it. His son is now the high priest. Aaron, I'm sorry. And so we'll see that with Moses' shoulder. But we see Moses messed up. But after that, Moses doesn't go and start pouting. He still has work to do. Aaron is done. Moses still has work to do. So we see that Moses messed up tonight. Number two, we'll see that Moses lifts up. And this is where the famous story with the snakes comes in. An unusual chapter in the Bible. But beginning in verse 4, chapter 21, if you want to follow along with me, it says, from Mount Hor, they set up by the way to the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom, and the people became impatient, here we go, on the way. And the people spoke against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in this wilderness? We could just copy and paste, all these complaints over the years. They say, for there is no food and no water, and we loathe this worthless food. Here they are contradicting themselves. But the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, so that many people of Israel died. And the people came to Moses and said, oh, now they like Moses again. We have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that he may take away the serpents from us. So Moses prayed for the people, and the Lord said to Moses, make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole, and everyone who is bitten, when he sees it, shall live. So Moses made a bronze serpent and set it on a pole. And if a serpent bit anyone, he would look at the bronze serpent and live. Again, they're complaining, tired of walking, growing impatient, coming against Moses, grumbling against God. And so, God's already given them every punishment he can give them at this point. When all else fails, he just sends snakes, right? God has done every other thing he can do. And this is probably a last straw. A last resort. God says, fine, here's some snakes. As a parent, you ever say this to your kids? If you don't quit crying, I'm going to give you something to cry about. You ever say that to them? If you don't quit complaining, I'm going to give you something to complain about. I can just imagine God saying that from heaven. Complaining again? And I'm feeding you, I'm giving you water from a rock, for crying out loud. I'm giving you everything you need. We talked about this. The clothes aren't wearing out. Their sandals aren't wearing out. God's fighting their battles for them. Everything they want, God provides for it. And complaining again, it's like God says, if y'all just like complaining, I'll actually give you something to complain about. Because your lives are pretty good. I set you free from slavery. I've given you a good life. If y'all just want to complain, here, have some snakes, some fiery serpents. Now, we don't know what kind of snakes they were. It's not too descriptive here, but it says people are dying from the snake bite. So these are not little black snakes that are in your garden. These are some type of venomous, poisonous, deadly snakes. Y'all know my position on snakes. Absolutely hate them. I don't understand anyone who would ever keep a pet snake somewhere in their house. I think that's just weird. If that's anybody here, I'm not sorry about it. That's weird. You should not have a pet snake. I think snakes are like the embodiment of the devil. Satan himself was once a snake. I think there's a reason for that. I think snakes are demonic. They creep me out. I just look at them and they look evil to me. Anybody else? Snakes just look evil in the face. Thank you very much. Amen. I believe that the only good snake's a dead snake. I know some of y'all don't kill the black ones. They go in the garden, they eat the mice, they eat the other snakes. Nope. If I have a chance to kill a black snake, I'm killing a black snake. A couple of days ago, I was driving on 49 down in Monarch, and a snake was crossing the road. That was the last thing that snake ever did. I veered into oncoming traffic so I could run over that snake. I looked at him in my rear view mirror as he, quote-unquote started flipping around, and I said, that's one less snake to the glory of God. You're welcome, Monarch community. There's people say, don't kill those black snakes. No, I hate them. And if I can kill them, you better believe I will. Now, I did dial 911 for that one that was in the parsonage. That's because it was up on a shelf, and I wasn't reaching up there for it. So if they're down the ground, I'm going to kill it. But I move on. But I hate snakes. And so when I read this, it just gives me the creeps thinking about snakes everywhere in the camp. And there's nothing you can do. They're biting people and killing people. And this is the punishment of God. This is not just some fluke thing. It wasn't just some snake outbreak. This is God saying, enough complaining already. What else do I have to do to get you to stop complaining? And these snakes are going around biting people. And so the very ones who were just grumbling at Moses, you brought us out of Egypt. You brought us to this evil place. Moses, we don't like you anymore. And now here they are going back to Moses. Moses, would you please pray for us? Would you please intercede once again? Would you go to God on our behalf? What are they complaining about? There's no food, there's no water, and we hate this food. Wait a second, I thought there was no food. Did you notice that when they complain? We have no food, and we hate this food. You know what that means? It means there was food. It means they just didn't like what they had. It's like when you go and open the pantry, or you go in the cupboard or somewhere in your house, and you look at all the boxes of pasta and all the jars of things, and maybe, if you're like me, that whole dinner in a box from Betty Crocker, and you're looking at all those things and the can of green beans and all this stuff, and you say, there's nothing to eat in here. And you've got all this food in there, and you say, there's nothing to eat. Sure there is. We just get spoiled sometimes, and we want something more than this. Say, oh, there's no food out here, and we hate all this food. I thought there wasn't any food. There was. They're just complaining. Even when God is feeding them, they're complaining about their daily bread. And now they're running back to Moses. Would you please pray for us, Moses? Wow, Moses, I'd be like, guys, didn't you hear? I'm going to die. I'm not even getting to go in the promised land. Why would I pray for you with what time I have left? But no, not Moses. Such a good guy. Even after he's messed up, even after he's been banished from the promised land, he intercedes on their behalf once again. And God says, yeah, just make a serpent, put it up on a pole, everything will be okay. So now Moses has to go through the trouble of making a serpent and putting it on a pole. I mean, again, I'd be like, God, why? You already told me I'm going to die, and now I've got to do this? I've got to do this meaningless chore for these complainers? But Moses does it because he's a good person. And again, that shows us how we should act, how we should be. I mean, he's learned he better obey God. And so here he is doing it. But even when things aren't going our way, as they weren't going Moses' way, he still obeys God. And certainly should be commended for doing so. So God says, anyone who looks at this bronze serpent, anyone who just looks at it, will be healed. You get bit, you're going to die. But no problem. Just look at that bronze serpent that Moses has made. It's an interesting story. The Bible doesn't tell us why it happened that way, why God did it that way. But he did. I believe that God did it this way, looking ahead into the future, and knowing that a couple of thousand years later, Jesus himself will see in this event something so closely picturesque of what salvation is, that Jesus would preach to Nicodemus, and he would use this event. So I'm going to turn to John chapter 3. If you want to turn there, you can. But we're going to read a verse or two from this very famous chapter, and then we will conclude tonight. But in John chapter 3, an event you're probably quite familiar with, when Nicodemus comes to Jesus by night, and he begins to maybe interrogate or maybe investigate Jesus, asking about salvation. And here's what Jesus tells him. Beginning in verse 13. Jesus says, no one has ascended into heaven except he who is descended from heaven, the Son of Man. Jesus giving a clue as to who he is, using Ezekiel's title, the Son of Man. But in verse 14, Jesus continues and says, just as Moses lifted up a serpent in the wilderness, well, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. And in that verse that we all know, but we see it in this context, for God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. You go back to Numbers 21. People are perishing. They are dying. But Moses lifted up a serpent so that whoever would just simply look at it would not perish, but would have life. And so Jesus sees in this a perfect analogy of something that is just about to happen to him. Yet just as Moses lifted up that serpent so that those who were dead and dying, if they would just simply look up, they could be saved. And in the same way, the Son of Man must also be lifted up. This is not the way that Ezekiel presented the Son of Man to us. And so Jesus is beginning to change what was so commonly thought of, what the Messiah would be. They weren't expecting a Messiah that would die. They were not expecting one they would view as weak if he dies on a cross, or embarrassing if he's a blasphemer. They're expecting someone to rule with an iron fist and set up that throne of David and rule from Jerusalem forever. And Jesus says, no. The Son of Man's got to be lifted up. And the expression he used that we lose in English, but being lifted up, referred to crucifixion for them. It didn't in Numbers 21, because crucifixion did not exist and would not even be invented for thousands of years. But Jesus made a word play. Yeah, Moses lifted up a serpent in the wilderness, but God is going to lift up or crucify the Son of Man. Moses did it so that all who were perishing can be saved. But God the Father is going to lift up his Son so that all who are perishing can be saved. And we quote John 3:16 all the time. Often, though, trimming out verse 14 before it or verse 15 before it. But we look at Jesus use what Moses did as a picture of salvation. So as we conclude this morning, think about what Moses did and what Jesus did. What Moses lifted up versus who or what God the Father lifted up. Moses said, if you look at the snake, you'll live. If you don't, you'll die. The Bible tells us that if we would just simply look to the cross, that we will live. And if we don't, we'll die. The Bible says, looking unto Jesus, the author and the finisher of our faith. If we would simply lift up our eyes to that old rugged cross, we will find salvation. But think about people in the camp. Moses, you're telling me I've got to go look at this serpent you made, and that's supposed to save me? No thanks, Moses. I got to go find a doctor. Moses, I got to go track down some kind of medicine or some kind of herb or some kind of ointment or whatever primitive medicine they had back then. But Moses, you're telling me to go stop what I'm doing and go look at your snake? My life is on the line here, Moses. I don't have time to go look at your snake. Moses says, if you just look at it, you'll live. If you don't, you'll die. And yet there's people today that say, you're telling me that all I've got to do is look to the cross, look to Jesus, look to what happened 2,000 years ago? That's not enough. No, I've got to go to church. I've got to go give my money. I've got to go volunteer. I've got to go do this or that, whatever my religious duty is. You're telling me all I got to do is look unto Jesus? No, that just doesn't seem like enough. I've got to do more than that. The Bible tells us if we just look unto Jesus, we'll be saved. But there's so many people that think, nope, that's too simple. I don't need to do that, or I've got to do more than that. You look at Jesus, you look at the cross, you'll live. Moses used a snake because the snake was what was killing everybody. And on the cross, Jesus became our sin because our sin is what was killing us. And so Moses used the very emblem of what was making them perish. And Jesus came down here and became what was making us perish. The bronze snake was put on a pole in the center of the camp where everybody could see it, where the people were. It was not put inside the tabernacle because religion doesn't save anybody. And Jesus came down to where the people are. And he doesn't say, if you want to be saved, you need to go to church on Sunday. No, we can be saved wherever we are. And so we need to take the message out to the people, because just getting a sinner inside this building does not save them. But if we take the message of Christ to them where they are, they can be saved. Moses didn't put the serpent inside the tabernacle and say, y'all go to church if you want to be saved. He put it out there where the people are, and we've got to take the gospel message where the people are. Each person had to look for themselves. You can't say, oh, my neighbor got bit, so while I'm here, I'm going to look for my neighbor too. No, your neighbor's got to go look. You can only look for yourself. You can only save yourself. And in the same way, we can't save anybody else. We can't get saved for our kids. We can't get saved for our neighbor. We can't get saved for our loved ones as much as we'd like to do it. Each person, whosoever, must make that same choice for themselves. And you know that. But also make sure you understand that no one else's salvation covers you. Just because your parents were saved doesn't mean you're saved. As people say all the time, oh, I was born Catholic. You hear that mostly with Catholicism, although it can be said about it, oh, I was born Christian, I was born Baptist. No, that doesn't mean anything. You have to be born again. It doesn't matter what you were born into. You must be born again. It's what Jesus told Nicodemus in the same chapter. It's So I don't care if you were born Baptist. I don't care if you were in this nursery right after you were born. You have to be born again. No one else's salvation can cover you. As each person had to look at the serpent themselves to be saved, so each one of us must lift our eyes up to Jesus ourselves to be saved. We're not saved vicariously through anyone else. We have to make sure it's what we do on our own. We sang that song, Draw Me Close, and I begin by pointing out those lyrics that say, you're all I want, you're all I've ever needed. And for the people in the camp of Israel, they had to decide, is God really all they need? Is he really all they want? They complain. God wasn't enough for them. God's blessings weren't enough for them. The manna was not enough for them. The water was not enough for them. God himself was not enough. And we see that so many times in Israel's history. Is he enough, though, for you? Is God enough for you? Is he all you want? Do you understand he's all you've ever needed? He's all you need. And if you ever put your faith in Christ to save you tonight, then I certainly invite you to do so. It's as simple as just lifting up your eyes to the cross. Taking a good long look at Jesus. Because I always believe that if a person seriously investigates Jesus for themselves, they're going to be left with only one conclusion. He's exactly who he claims to be. He's the Lord of all the universe. And so you lift your eyes up to Jesus tonight if you've never done so. If you have, if you're already a Christian, tonight maybe you want to look anew at the cross. You want to look up to Jesus again and say, God, lead me in all I do. Guide me in all my ways. God, let me never take my eyes off of you. The best way to navigate this life is with our eyes fixed on the cross, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. I'm going to ask you to please stand tonight as Miss Nancy's going to play for us. Just stand up and use this time as we do every Sunday night to pray. If you want to come down here and kneel down, you can. There's nothing magical about the altar, but if you want to come down here and kneel for prayer, you certainly can, or have someone pray with you, we'd love to. If you want to sit down and pray, stand and pray, whatever you want to do, use this opportunity now to talk to God. So Lord, I pray in these next few minutes you would move among us. Lord, I pray that Christians will be praying. If there's something we need tonight, I pray we find it. If someone needs to look unto you tonight for guidance, I pray that they would do it. Lord, if there's one here tonight that's not saved, and they've tried to do it some other way, tried to add